Hi everyone, I hope you'll enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Keep in mind that this was recorded before Alex Jones was finally booted off Twitter, so I just wanted to mention that, and also wanted to pop in and say thank you to the new patrons who signed up last month, and all the lovely patrons who generally keep the show going. Every month, patrons come and go, so it's listeners like you that make this possible. It's important to get new patrons to replace those that leave so the show can have some breathing room. And I'm also just a few patrons away from hitting my 250 patron mark. Once we hit that, I'll be doing a second patron AMA. Help me get there by signing up on Patreon and participate in the upcoming AMA. I know thousands listen to the show, but only a very small fraction of people actually support it. If you could toss a couple of bucks into the old Patreon, it would help more than you know. Now, on to the episode.
Make sure that that program doesn't contain controversial subjects and you're not impolite to people.
No, definitely not, Dad. You know me. I'm never, ever controversial or impolite.
Yeah. Okay.
Welcome to Conversations with your lovable, never pisses anyone off, ex-Muslim host Ina, keeping it non-controversial. Hello everyone, welcome to episode 51 with Chris Stroop. Exvangelical activist and writer, created the viral hashtag you may have heard of Empty the Pews. How's it going, Chris?
I'm doing all right, thanks, Ina. How are you?
I am very well. It's the first day back after Labor Day long weekend, and It's nice to chat with you this morning.
Thanks. Yeah, I've been looking forward to chatting with you. It's been fun to connect on Twitter.
Definitely. You're one of the few people that are like, secularist and also not like going down this strange path that we'll get into discussing,
Yeah, I mean, I'd say the same thing about you. Of course, some people in secularist or atheist communities, which of course don't exist.
Of course they don't exist, because if they don't exist, you can't criticize them.
They find me too religious for them, but then there are religious people who find me too secularist, and I do weird things that probably, confuse some people on both sides, but I'm just doing my thing.
Yeah. So are you still religious?
No, I wouldn't say that. I'm definitely not religious. I consider myself a non-religious agnostic, but in as much as I'm committed to working with progressive religious groups, and progressive Christians and interfaith coalitions, I've encountered many people in the non-existent atheist community who find that troubling and not something that they approve of. And I've even written content for a devotional app.
Oh, really?
And it was put in, this is very recent, and it was put in the spiritual but definitely not religious category. And I kind of wanted to quibble a little bit about the term spiritual, but it's the Our Bible app. It was created by Crystal Cheatham. And I wrote a 10-day series of secular meditations for the deconstructing and reconstructing, where I took my usual position that, that we take, I think the most prominent representatives anyway of the exvangelical community take this position, that those of us who come out of a toxic religious background, those of us who come out of evangelicalism in this sense, but many of us connect with wider sort of ex-fundamentalist communities as well. We have a lot in common, and we have a lot of things to unpack. And so I try not to hammer too hard on the anti-religious stuff. I try to validate all paths out of toxic religion, whether that lands you in a healthy form of religion or outside religion altogether.
Yeah.
I've talked to Ryan Bell about that. And I was just on Crystal Cheatham's podcast as well.
Is it like a Christian podcast?
Sort of. She's awesome. She bills it as a podcast about God, the Bible, and sex, I think is the way that she puts it. But there's a lot of sex in there. It's pretty great. It's a very queer podcast. She's a really fun, smart person. She created this app. She told me that she now regrets that she called it the Our Bible app because she'd like it to be more inclusive than that.
Yeah.
And, the people who write for it, it's mostly people from marginalized groups, a lot of women of color, and they write very inclusive sort of devotionals. And some of them really still find a lot of inspiration in the Bible. And she wanted to make this app because pretty much all devotional literature out there, for the most part, is made for white conservative Christians. I mean, in the Christian tradition.
Right.
And she wanted to challenge that. So, yeah, on her podcast, which is called Lord Have Mercy, she pushed me a bit on, am I a spiritual person? And I said, well, if you define that without reference to metaphysics, if we can bracket that entirely, but if you mean, am I searching for meaning, and do I want to dive into values and try to discover things about being human and make something meaningful out of that, then yes, you could call me a spiritual person. But skip the woo, skip the metaphysical dogma.
Yeah, and I do think that approach is necessary in some situations. So I'm glad there's people like you that are sort of okaying maybe a path from within that framework for people to become less and less attached to their dogmatic ways of practicing religion, right? I never understood the all or nothing approach, even in my most heightened new atheist days. Like, I'm happy to speak with progressive theists and ally with them when we have the same values. Or I do have some issues with people that reinterpret scripture in a progressive way and just say that every other interpretation is wrong. It's it's fine if you're doing that for yourself or you want to have a more queer friendly interpretation, but to say that everyone else has been wrong throughout the ages to interpret this as homophobic, it's just been misunderstood. I find a bit gaslighty, and it really frustrates me when people do that.
I agree with you there. I mean, I'm thinking of it more with respect to the Bible than the Quran, which I know much less well, though I did read an English translation or interpretation, as Muslims would insist.
You read the whole thing?
Yeah, I read it through.
Wow, good for you. Boring, huh?
Well, I mean, it wasn't the most interesting reading I'd ever done, but there were some interesting things in there. And this was probably about going on 20 years ago, and I have, not read the whole thing again since or dipped into it much.
Can't blame you.
I felt like I should. And when it comes to the Bible, I also press people all the time when they insist that, say, Trump-supporting Christians are just fake Christians or right-wing readings of the text are just wrong.
It's the same thing with ISIS and Islamists, right? It's trying to shift the blame elsewhere. This is not Islam. This is not... Well, no, there's so many ways to interpret Islam, and if you start saying one interpretation is right and everything else is wrong, then you're acting like the fundamentalists.
Right. Then we're getting into theology, and that's, I think, ultimately going to be a fruitless debate, right? Because when people disagree in theology, there's no outside arbitrator.
Well, God ain't coming down.
Oh, hey, this is the right interpretation after all. Everyone else, go home. I mean, if it were so obvious that there's one objective, true interpretation of religious texts that are used as the basis for religious communities, and the interpretation is always historically and sociologically and communally mediated. If there were just one objective reading, then why do we have all these numerous divisions in both Islam and Christianity and Judaism? And any text-based religion has fractured and fractured and fractured because, you know what, they're not fucking straightforward texts.
Right. I mean, even texts from people that are still around, people will interpret articles in so many different ways, and certain writers will kind of want to be saying something, but then when they get called on it, they'll be like, no, that's not what I meant, So even though they're still around, there's a lot of confusion around those texts. So why wouldn't there be confusion around, texts that are over 1,000 years old with a morality from so long ago? Trying to fit it into today is no easy task. And if you just say that everyone else is wrong and you're really moderate and 21st century version is the one that was always meant to be, it seems like a dick move to me.
I agree. It's totally ahistorical. My professional training in the academy is as a historian. I'm not a historian of the ancient world, but nevertheless, I bring my historical training to any kind of text that I read or any kind of big sort of social phenomenon around it. And so to say that the progressive reading is, oh, hey, we finally got it right, is just complete nonsense.
And similarly, even like the sort of more literalist, atheist, right-wing people you see will like try to hold Muslims to the most fundamentalist, literalist standards and be like, well, no, they can't be a real Muslim if they're gay and so tolerant and whatever. And it's like, this sounds so familiar, but you can't decide for other people.
Right. And so I'm also, all for these kinds of text-based religions or certain communities and groups in them, because it's never going to be all of them evolving and coming up with a more progressive interpretation of it. Well, sometimes translations too do have their ideological overtones, but that's a different thing.
Yeah.
That's great, but people from both sides should not insist that that's the only thing that qualifies as real Christianity or real Islam, because that's simply sociological, historical, and anthropological nonsense.
Right.
It's really unhelpful, and I think it's often damaging to people who come out of toxic versions of these faiths. And I feel erased when people say that Trump-supporting Christians are fake Christians. And so one of my most controversial blog posts is precisely about that, and one of the most widely read. It's called "About Those Trump Voters for God. Stop calling them fake Christians."
Yeah.
So I push that button when I get the progressive Christians getting defensive, or Christians who want to present themselves as progressive, even if they're not, getting defensive and doing not all Christians.
Yeah.
I finally wrote a long argued essay response so I could just post a link when that came up, because it comes up all the time.
Yeah, I'll be sure to link it in the show notes. Yeah, and in terms of Islam, like we already have these issues where people exclude certain beliefs, like Ahmadis, right? They say this is not true Islam, and then it becomes murderous from there. So you can't be playing into that, even as a progressive. You don't want to define what's true and what's not true, because you're really just feeding into already that divisiveness.
Right, absolutely. But at the same time, to get back to your point of can we have a conversation with progressive believers and why that's important, I do think we need to do that, but I'll call them out if they insist that their interpretation is like the only one.
Yeah, exactly. I think I'm in the same place as you on that. Like I'd be happy to ally with a progressive theist that has my my left-leaning, diversity, inclusive, feminist values over a right-wing, anti-immigration, anti-diversity atheist any day, just because the both of us don't believe in God, it doesn't really make us the same at all.
Right, and not every conversation that we have with believers has to be a debate. I mean, some of my favorite conversations are those that I've recently had, with the progressive Christian Crystal Cheatham, and I'm writing another 10-day series of secular reflections for her devotional app this month.
Yeah.
She asked me to do it again. So, she's great to talk to, and we can talk about what we disagree about, but we don't have to talk about it all the time, because we have plenty of other common ground to find and go over, or we can just laugh and joke, or we can talk about sex and,
Yeah. I mean, there's always something in the back of my mind that bothers me when I have these conversations with believers. I'm just like, yeah, but this isn't, I mean, I guess that's the atheist in me, right? Like I am a pretty staunch atheist. As much as I, criticize the movement atheist communities and leaders, I still am like, okay, I love that you are inclusive and LGBT friendly, but there's always something where, there was a documentary that I saw about Muslim drag queens where they're already, turned away from their families and their communities, so they understand the hardships each other are going through, and it's nice that they're building a community. But then they're practicing in a pub, like, for their show at night, and then one of the people wanted to, like, just take a break and pray. But one of the other people was like, no, but that's haram. You can't do that. There's alcohol in the premises. And I'm like, yeah, but you already know that you guys aren't following everything to the T. So why these like little strict little rules again, you know? So
yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying.
It's hard to wrap my mind around it sometimes, but sometimes it just doesn't have to go there.
Yeah. And I mean, that's how it often is with some of the people that I work with most who are progressive Christians, and we're able to have good conversations and even just be very frank about having very substantive disagreements and bracketing those and saying, you know, this is what I think and this is what you think. We don't have to always turn it into a debate.
Exactly.
Not everything has to be a debate all the time.
Believe me. I mean, I see like the random dudes on Twitter like trying to debate random women in hijabs on Twitter. Like, just because they have a hijab in their profile doesn't mean that they're open to debating every atheist douchebag that comes along. One time I was speaking, definitely a dick move. Yeah, I was speaking with this one Muslim convert, and she's so lovely and accepting of ex-Muslims, and she does these interfaith events, and I was asking her if she would be open to hosting Satanists or a Satanist group in a mosque for an interfaith event, right? So she was like, you know, she didn't really know what it was. She was thinking about it a bit. But then she came back with, yeah, why not? You know, as someone who didn't know what it was, I wasn't so open to it in the beginning, but now that I've read about it a bit, and yeah, why not? And that would have been so cool, so historical, you know, if there was a interfaith event in a mosque with a Satanist group. Can you imagine? Like, that'd be the coolest thing.
That would certainly be interesting, yeah.
But then this atheist bro came by and was like, you know, why do you have to think about Satanism, like as if your religion is any good or tolerant? And he just started like throwing insults at her, like,
oh no,
it was just so unnecessary. And I don't think that the conversation went anywhere after that, because she's like, oh my gosh, if I interact with Heine, maybe these are the kinds of people that come at me. So, but it was nice to try.
Yeah, those guys can be really annoying. They just jump into all kinds of random threads and try to start reasonable debates with you that aren't reasonable at all.
I know.
And they're not willing to recognize that they're being rude, and they're heavily emotionally invested, and they're right to be super rude.
And it's called what? Sea lioning, right? It's like, I'm just asking a question. Why won't you talk to me? Why? I'm just asking a reasonable question. And you know that no matter what you say, it's not going to be accepted as a valid answer. It's like the guys that ask you for just one example of Peterson's sexism or misogyny. Just show me just one. And it's like, you can show them 100, but...
Yeah, they'll explain each one away. They'll rationalize each one.
Yeah.
That's what they do. Whatever evidence you submit is going to be ruled inadmissible, and we all know this in advance.
Yeah, exactly. So what is the point? This isn't a good faith discussion, right? So, yeah. I have to say, though, to change the topic a little bit, I really admire and envy even how the exvangelical community can talk about and criticize harshly their former communities without having their struggle or their, you know, conversation hijacked by douchebags that want to hate on Christians as people. You know what I mean? Like, it's kind of like maybe how you might feel in Pakistan as an ex-Christian trying to criticize Christianity, but anytime you do that, the Islamists come and join in, like, yeah, Christianity sucks, and you're like, no, not you, you know?
I mean, it does happen, but I think it probably, because, you know, the people in the non-existent atheist community tend to be hyper-focused on Islam. I'm sure it doesn't happen as much. But we do get people making totally tone-deaf comments, or just kind of like, you know, just kind of spouting off, parroting basic little phrases and talking points about how, all religion is terrible or whatever. You get those in the comments sometimes. And I think we're mostly able to ignore it if it's really irrelevant, as it usually is, to the subject that's being discussed.
Yeah.
But yeah, like you said, atheists try to insist that the only valid version of Islam is extreme fundamentalist Islamism, and they do the same thing with Christianity.
It's not just atheists though. With say ex-Muslims, it's like right-wing Christians always trying to hijack our conversation or our struggle. If we're critical of Islam, the right-wing Christians are like, yeah, let me put my arms around you. Come over here.
Right, which is such complete and total bullshit, because they would love to be able to get away with, many of the things that they're supposedly criticizing about fundamentalist Muslims. Like, they're anti-feminist, they're anti-LGBT. They might not say that they prescribe wife beating or something like that, most of them.
Yeah.
Some actually really might prescribe a form of, discipline with the man as the, head of the family, like Christ is the head of the church.
Yeah.
But they certainly want to create all kinds of cover for terrible abuses of women and children to happen. And they do happen all the time in fundamentalist Christian communities, particularly those that homeschool, because we have almost no regulation of homeschooling in this country. Probably still a majority, although it seems like homeschooling has been becoming more popular with liberals and sort of leftists and California type liberals in recent years who are all anti-vax and whatever, and believe in healing crystals. So some of them, or some of them are really homeschooling for legitimate reasons. American schools are in decline because of our terrible education policy over the years. But still, I think a majority most likely is done by fundamentalists who are homeschooling their children so that they can totally control their access to information and totally control other aspects of their lives. There are a lot of extreme cases out there that are very well documented. If you look at the website of Homeschoolers Anonymous, for example, cases of parents not even getting their children basic documents like birth certificates and social security cards, or withholding those things to control them as adults, denying them access to good education. And most of the curricula have been designed for homeschooling, have been designed by Christian fundamentalists to propagate Christian Reconstructionist, Dominionist views.
Yeah, a lot of that does not sound too different from conservative Islamic right-wing parents as well, It's just a difference of what they're allowed to get away with. As you were saying, they would probably like to get away with more, but they just can't.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a huge child marriage problem in the United States, child brides. And it's not the 1% of the population that is Muslim that is the issue here. It's our Christian fundamentalist communities. It's the people who grew up in Roy Moore type communities that they force their daughters into terrible marriages, sometimes when they're in their teens, early teens even, or even as young as 11 or 12, to much older men. There have been exposés on this.
And I mean, you saw the support he still got, right?
Oh, yeah. He got over 80% of the white evangelical vote in the Alabama special election for Senate to fill Jeff Sessions' seat. Also, there have been, there has been good reporting about the child marriage problem in the United States. In the last couple of years, there have been initiatives in states. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head which states, either Kentucky or Tennessee, Florida. There have been states that have tried to put strict legal limits on child marriage. The pushback comes from the Christian right. They don't want that. Yeah. So they really want to have their cake and eat it too. They don't want to outlaw child marriage. There's also a huge fundamentalist homeschooling lobby headed up by an organization called the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, the HSLDA, which has been very, very effective in mobilizing these homeschooling families as its foot soldiers to initially, starting back in the 80s when they started to chip away at this. And I'm not sure exactly when HSLDA was founded, but now it's to keep homeschooling from being regulated, because back then, when that general movement toward fundamentalist homeschooling was growing rapidly, a lot of states still did have some pretty robust regulations around homeschooling, and those have now been entirely dismantled.
Okay.
And so predictably, and I mean, it's state by state, but most states regulate homeschooling almost not at all. And if you don't comply, there's probably nothing's going to happen, even with the very minimal regulation that exists. They use fear-mongering, actually get the HSLDA's mailing list so I can see what they're up to. And they scare parents into thinking that the government just wants to take your children away. CPS is the enemy. And we have to make sure that parents have total freedom, which is a Christian Reconstructionist point of view. I mean, it's really the thoroughgoing Christian Reconstructionists still believe that parents should have the right to stone rebellious children.
Oh my God.
Now, I think most of your homeschooling fundamentalist Christian families would not go that far. I'd like to see actually a public opinion poll, but people don't always tell the truth in those.
They don't, yeah.
But I mean, that is the view of someone like R.J. Rushdoony, who is he's dead now, but he's the founder of Christian Reconstructionism, an extreme form of Calvinism, and his views, even if people don't adhere to the whole thing, have been very influential, and their influence has spread through homeschooling and through Christian schools like the kind that I graduated from.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, I'd like to hear a bit more about your backstory and how you got to leaving and all of that, if you wouldn't mind getting into it.
Sure. So when I was born in far northern Indiana, small town, lived there till I was about 4 or 5 years old. My dad was a marching band director back then, and then he was just kind of a freelance musician, composer, arranger, wrote some jingles and things for a while, but then he became a music pastor. And my mom, as soon as my sister and I were old enough to go to school, she had gotten a teaching degree. She taught, I think, before I was born for a year or two in public school, but then she went to teach in a Christian school. So I was raised by a music pastor and a Christian school teacher.
So what exactly is a music pastor?
Oh, well, sometimes also called worship leader. It's someone who, coordinates the music in a church service. And
at least you guys are allowed music.
I mean, there are Christian traditions that don't use musical instruments in the service. But yeah, we eventually got into this kind of so-called seeker-sensitive movement where you try to make church sort of like a rock show to bring people in, and you sell them the same conservative ideology, but in a cool package.
You mean like Jordan Peterson?
Yeah, kind of.
He's the atheist circuit Christian. He does the strange events that are like considered the rock shows of the IDW now. So that's why it reminded me of him.
Yeah. This is the whole megachurch phenomenon, which is really a thing. And there are a lot of like wannabe megachurches. So
like the IDW. Kid. But yeah,
they might be smaller churches that, also use this aesthetic and this lingo. It's like hipster Christianity, and it's still misogynistic, and it's still homophobic, but it's so cool. Look at that band. So
see, at least you can. This is what I mean. Like, you can talk about this stuff. We have this in Islam too. We have the hipster right-wing Muslims with the hijabs and stuff. There are, of course, progressive people wearing hijabs as well. Not the face veils. I can't agree to that. I don't see how anyone progressive would wear a face veil. But hijabs, yes, I've seen all kinds of people wear hijabs for different reasons. But ultimately, it's like a modesty garment, based on some very sexist ideas. And it's very hard and getting harder for people like me to just push back against our right wing, because the second that we do, we have Trumpians and right-wing Christians and anti-immigrants just jumping on that conversation to applaud us and retweet us into more and more racist audiences. And that's not what we want at all. We just want to nudge the hipster conservatism that goes on in our own communities. But it's almost impossible.
Yeah, I hear you. There are some real challenges. I mean, with the way, and I really appreciate your approach, because you don't go in with the ex-Muslims who go all the way to total bashing and Islamophobia, which I think it's important to avoid, and who don't see the double standards there that you've just recently called out in this conversation with the way that Christianity is treated and with the way that Christians say, we don't want Sharia law. No, we just want Christian child marriage.
Yeah.
We just want Christian parents to be able to stone their rebellious children.
Yeah, and that makes me the most unpopular ex-Muslim that just refuses to follow the path set out for me.
It makes you my favorite ex-Muslim, for what it's worth.
Thank you. But yeah, I don't have any book deals or any fancy stage events with people who like to spread race IQ theories. So, yeah.
Well, good. I wouldn't like you if you did. But.
I know. Me neither.
I hope you are you thinking about writing a book, though? Because I'm sure you probably could write a book that is not for that crowd. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about it. I'm more into like writing kids' books or like simplifying these conversations in the forms of like illustrations and things like that. So maybe once I do that, get that out of my system, then I might think about a fully adult book with no pictures. But yeah, sorry, I sidetracked this conversation entirely. What were you talking about? You were talking about the hipster Christianity, conservatism. Well,
yeah. So I mean, we got into that at a certain point when I was in 6th grade. My dad got a phone call from this pastor named Ron Clarkson who wanted to start what they call a church plant. It was under the umbrella of a big organization called the Missionary Church, but it would be within the missionary church theology, but it would be basically non-denominational. Like they wouldn't put a lot of emphasis on whether people going there come from a missionary church background. It would be about being hip and cool to get the unchurched, as a phrase they like to use, into the church, and then play rock music and do cool things with lights and sell them, toxic theology in a hip and practical that you can apply to your daily life kind of pattern.
Yeah. See, to me, that even that sounds more progressive than what a lot of mosques are willing to do. I mean, we're starting to get there. There are some sex ed discussions happening, though I fear what the fuck they talk about in that, because there's a lot of shame in Muslim sex ed. It's about shaming people. It's not really sex ed. But at least they're starting to utter the word sex, I suppose.
I mean, you probably know how prevalent abstinence-only sex education is in the United States, and how they're pushing the current, the Trump regime is pushing for more of it, and is directing funding toward that sort of thing.
Someone like Trump pushing for abstinence for other people. It's unbelievable.
He doesn't. He knows his base is white evangelicals and open racists, and I mean, so his most important base is conservative Christians, white evangelicals, Mormons, radical traditionalist Catholics, and he's perfectly happy to do what they want. Yeah, it's incredibly hypocritical, but they don't care.
Yeah, and he doesn't care how blatant it is.
He's advancing their agenda, and he doesn't care because they like him. So yeah, I mean, I had some terrible, what I would call fake sex ed in Christian school. In fact, that first half of 6th grade, before we moved to Colorado Springs to join the mega church inspired church plant. And by the way, though, speaking of mega churches, one of I suppose you could say probably the single pastor who did the most to build this movement more than anyone else would be Bill Hybels, and his church was located in a suburb of Chicago called Willow Creek, and there have just been all these big revelations about him, involving sexual assaults and various other kinds of hypocritical situations. So that doesn't surprise me at all. The hip cool package they want to sort of be quasi-progressive in some ways. I mean, Bill Hybels,
just superficially.
but they're not really. I mean, Bill Hybels was known for putting women in leadership roles, which is certainly something that you can't do. In many Christian denominations, though he was always, I think, pretty authoritarian head of his own church. But some of his lieutenants were women. However, some of them he also, groomed or groped or invited to his hotel room awkwardly when they were traveling together, so they're really not progressive at all. But back to the fake sex ed. So we had this program called CPR, for creating positive relationships, and how I think it's probably common in sex ed programs where you have school children, students submit anonymous questions so that they can address them with nobody being embarrassed. Mm-hmm. But here they decided to embarrass and shame everybody for the one question that obviously was going to come up in a Christian school environment, which was, how far can you go with your boyfriend or girlfriend? So first of all, the two people who were leading this class shamed the class that we would even want to know the answer to that question, because you shouldn't be thinking about how far you can go. You should be thinking about, but if there is a line, you want to stay as far back from it as possible. But then they said, but if you have to have a line, you should definitely stay away from the underwear zone. They use the phrase the underwear zone and defined it as, any part of the body that would typically be covered by underwear. So don't touch any of that. But, in these programs, they also use a lot of rhetoric about, thinking about your future spouse, and you already are kind of bonded to the spouse that God has planned for you. So don't cheat on your future spouse by doing anything in a dating relationship with someone that you wouldn't be comfortable doing with someone else's wife or husband.
Yeah, I think I've heard. If you
marry that person, then you're taking their purity for whoever does marry them.
Yeah, I've heard in Islamic contexts of people thinking that masturbation is adultery, basically.
Well, the Bible actually has a phrase. I mean, Jesus was trying to, as presented in the Gospels, is represented as calling out the hypocrites of his own day. And some of his sayings are very harsh. And he's got this one where he says, "You've heard it is written, do not commit adultery. But I say unto you, if you have lusted after a woman in your heart, you've already committed adultery with her in your heart." So, I mean, this actually leads to some really weird parsing. Like, I remember some conversations where there was a time I was absolutely convinced that masturbation was a sin. But, I was able to have some conversations as I was very freaking out about this growing up with people who would say things like, well, it's probably impossible not to masturbate at all, but you shouldn't fantasize. You shouldn't think about people that you're attracted to. You should just make it purely mechanical, and then it's okay.
God, it's so strange. And it's funny because I used to write, specifically about sex and sexuality and in a Muslim context, specifically Pakistani context. So that's how I started off blogging. And throughout my research, I found that in a way, like in terms of sexuality or masturbation, I don't know, like it seemed Islam was a bit better than Christianity in some ways. Like there were some leaders that would say that, okay, at least masturbation is less of a sin than premarital sex or adultery. So if you got to do it, you got to do it,
Yeah, I mean, and some people in Christianity also, not the Catholic Church officially, they have one dogmatic line defined for all these things that comes from the magisterium itself, and the vast majority of people who officially adhere to the Catholic Church just throw all that bullshit away and still be Catholic somehow. But in Protestantism, you find a variety of approaches to things like that.
Yeah.
Some of which are a little better, a little bit more like you described in the Muslim world.
I mean, it's not really great either way.
No, definitely not.
But yeah.
And this fake sex ed program, CPR, another ridiculous thing that they did was they had this heart that was like two halves of a heart that was sort of Velcroed together or something. And they would pull it apart and stick it back together. And they would basically say that, that's like having sex with someone. It bonds you together. And every time you do it, though, like, the Velcro gets less less sticky, less Velcro-y. It might stop. It might stop working. And I was horrified to discover. I think about a year ago, I looked online to see if this program is still around, and it is still around, and it is in fact present in many Central Indiana public schools.
What?
Yep, that's America for you.
Oh my gosh. I mean, we are going a bit backwards in my province in Canada because our new premier has canceled the updated sex ed curriculum, and he wants to go back to an old one that from decades ago, from the 90s or something. It's so sad. There's like a Trumpy wave around the world. I don't know what's happening. I never thought that Ontario would entertain something or someone like him, but clearly.
Yeah, I mean, we have to ask how far is it going to go in different places. I mean, at least Canada started from a much better starting point than America in terms of progressive, inclusive values and a social safety net. But we are in a dangerous moment of right-wing populism, rising fascism, backlash against liberalism and so-called globalism and openness that is a global phenomenon. And, you know, one of the things that I've done professionally as a policy analyst is to publish some research looking into the right-wing networks internationally that are involved in this sort of thing. Later this month, we have one of the most important annual events coming up for these kind of networks, and it's an organization that has been essentially a Russian-American project since its very inception, and that's the World Congress of Families. And following a pattern from recent years, it's going to be held sort of in Russia's backyard. It's going to be held in Chisinau, Moldova this year. Moldova has a very Trumpy and pro-Putin president right now, Igor Dodon. And right now, so that organization in the past was headed up by a Protestant, Alan Carlson. He has stepped down from leading the World Congress of Families out of the Howard Center for Religion and Family Life in Illinois. And it's now headed by Brian Brown, who's a Catholic and also still heads the National Organization for Marriage.
Wow.
And he's been building this bigger advocacy organization around the event, which is a very important networking kind of event where people compare projects, legislative initiatives, talking points. I mean, it's not just they get together and hang out and it doesn't change anything, but it's a real vehicle for influence and for approaches to try to oppose human rights, particularly for women and LGBT people.
Delightful.
Can be exchanged. He's building a bigger advocacy organization around it now, which is called the International Organization for the Family. And,
just that name alone is so lovely.
And he's constantly in Moscow. So that's interesting.
Yeah. Before we go deeper into your Russian stuff, let's get back to your life story, your backstory.
So I got, that half a year of fake sex ed, and then we were in Colorado Springs with the wannabe megachurch. And there I actually got to go to public school for the second half of sixth grade because in the middle of the year that was kind of the only option, where I got real sex ed. And it wasn't maybe not amazing, but it was completely different. It was very interesting.
How was that experience for you after all that?
I mean, I had a little bit of a difficult time, I think, fitting in the public middle school, being kind of weird anyway. But by the end of the year, I wanted to stay in the public school, and then they wouldn't let me. My mom was, again, a teacher at a Christian school. These Christian schools also demand that the teachers send their children there. And I mean, unless they're expelled for disciplinary reasons or something, which looks bad for the teacher, you pretty much have to go there.
That's crazy that they demand that they send their kids there.
I begged my parents to let me stay in my public middle school. They wouldn't let me. And at that time, too, I was getting real science classes, and I think that I was more or less accepting evolution and trying to find a way to square it with believing in God. But then I was back in Christian school for the rest of my entire schooling, and it took me well into college because I was trying so hard to hold on to faith, and I'd been told that you have to accept young earth creationism or the whole thing falls apart. Wow. I mean, fundamentalism is always a house of cards. I look back at some of the arguments I had with people in college trying to defend young earth creationism with just such embarrassment. But it was really kind of a matter of, rejecting that was going to possibly send me to hell. And even though I was in a serious crisis of faith, kind of going back to age 16, but it was very long and protracted for me and painful. So it wasn't easy to let go. And also saying, okay, evolution is true is going to have a serious social cost for me in the communities that I grew up in. And ultimately, it took me from the time I turned 16 till about the time I was almost 35 to become a very public, vocal critic of evangelical subculture.
What tipped you over?
Lots of things. Initially when I was 16 and I was in Christian school back in Indianapolis and I read through the entire Bible for the first time, a lot of things bothered me about it, like, divinely ordained genocide in in the conquest of Canaan and all of that, some of those stories, the seeming pettiness of God, and just kind of contradictions in the Bible that didn't seem to be able to be resolved. I've told this story before in a number of places, so I'll just kind of go fast through it. But I went to a pastor who was also a Bible teacher at our school, maybe not exactly at that time, but he was a little bit later. And he was also, I think, our pastor at that time. Yeah, he was, when I was maybe 16 or 17, with some of these doubts. And he gave me an apologetics book to read. And he seemed very understanding at first. I went home and read it. It was not one of the famous ones. I've forgotten what it was. It was in question and answer format. I found the answers too glib, and I went back and told him that I still had doubts, and suddenly he was telling me that the problem was with me, that I was clearly harboring sin in my life, that I was opening myself up to demonic influences. He sort of quasi-exorcised me. I tried to smash some things that might be vessels of demonic influence.
What do you mean quasi-exorcised you? Like, what did he do?
I mean, Protestants don't do the whole crucifix thing and, very specific rituals. They just pray against demons. Okay. They think Jesus gives us all permission to do that. Priesthood of all believers and all that. So it's not like a Catholic exorcism.
Still scary sounding, though.
Oh, it is, because it is very scary. And I mean, the whole way that fundamentalism works is to teach you to gaslight yourself and doubt your own doubts, right? Yeah. So suddenly you're like, I did masturbate the other day, or I can't stop being lustful, so I am harboring sin in my life.
Or you're normal.
That's why I can't read the Bible through the Holy Spirit. Oh. And if I could, it would all just make sense, and I would see that it's a book with no errors. Yeah. And when this is the message from your entire social community, and I would say that I grew up in a fundamentalist enclave community. It's not like there were absolutely no ties to the outside world, and I did have access to a lot of reading material that wasn't specifically designed for fundamentalist Christians. I was lucky in that regard. So I had sort of some windows into this outside world, but for the most part, our social world was church and Christian school. We didn't know anybody else. Yeah. My dad did, because of he was still doing freelance studio work, and he had all these connections in the music and recording communities. But, he kind of straddled two worlds. But my mom, my sister, and me, I mean, all our friends, all our relatives believe the same things, and we were told that if you don't believe those same things, you'll go to hell.
So when you finally came out of it and started speaking critically, how's your relationship with your family now?
There were definitely some rough years there. I felt out my dad slowly first on certain things like LGBTQ affirmation, misogyny and that sort of thing, literalism, just issues with the Bible. And he was a safe person to talk to about those sort of things because he's not fundamentally threatened by difference, which makes him really an odd fit for evangelicalism. But he and my mom, they met in college through the Christian campus house that they were involved in. And I think they were both just kind of looking for something to provide some solidity after the turbulence of the 60s. So they joined a bunch of other sort of young men and women of that generation and going cuckoo for culture wars and building up, everything that came next with the Christian schools and the homeschooling movement and the purity culture movement and so forth. And I think Dad just always just kind of went along with a lot of it. even if he didn't internalize everything or agree with everything, I think he always tries to see the best in people, and he was able to somehow compartmentalize or think that the worst parts of it weren't as pervasive as they are. So I kind of felt him out, and he was already more or less, he understood where I was coming from and was understanding toward me when I published this piece in 2015 that went viral. It was published on Religion Dispatches, but it got picked up by Salon and Alternate as well, where I was just very harshly critical of conservative evangelicals. And then,
So this is all fairly recent.
Yeah, I was definitely, by the time I finished college, I knew I couldn't call myself evangelical anymore. I remember telling that to one of my friends from Christian school who just really did not know how to react, and we haven't been close since. So, yeah, I kind of kept a lot of it down for a long time, but I was changing quite a bit, and learning more things about myself. And I didn't even recognize queerness in myself until I was in my 30s, because it's not a thing that exists for fundamentalists, and I think that I was able to do that in part because I am attracted to women, and I was able to repress that I can also be attracted to men. But then, in my mid-30s, I had a crush on a male friend, and I was like, wow, well, this is very interesting. And I got to a place where I could admit to those feelings and process those feelings, which was good.
Yeah, I'm really glad you got out. And
but it took, it just took a long time. And then, when I published that piece, my mom took it very, very badly. My aunt yelled at me for hurting my mom. My sister yelled at me for hurting my mom. Family members accused me of attacking everything we stand for, because that's how they see things, all or nothing.
Yeah.
But, then there were a couple of years of very hard conversations and tensions with my mom in particular. But now we're in a much better place where she can respect my boundaries, and it is what it is, and it's in the open. And I'm living with my parents right now and getting along with them,
Good.
Because I refused to become a poorly paid adjunct with no benefits after teaching at the University of South Florida for 3 academic years, first as a provost postdoctoral scholar in the social sciences and humanities, and then as a visiting instructor in the Honors College. I ran out of temporary but good with benefits academic jobs.
Yeah.
I couldn't get another one at the University of South Florida. I didn't have anywhere else to go. And I was thinking about staying there and adjuncting because I didn't want to move back home. But things were starting to kind of pop and snowball for me in some ways with the writing that I'm doing, and I'm getting some speaking invitations. And I really don't want to be an exploited adjunct anyway. I just think that these transformations that have happened in the American Academy, where around 80% of college teaching is done by adjunct instructors who don't get benefits, is horrendous. It's bullshit. And as many of us who can find a way to survive without doing that should rebel and burn the whole thing down, because PhDs on food stamps should not be a thing.
Yeah.
So I moved back home to focus on my writing and public speaking and things for a while, and see what I can make out of that.
Yeah, I really hope that it all works out, but I'm glad also that you have this chance to try your hand at this other stuff as well. So
thanks. Yeah, I'm getting more gigs. I'm getting more traction on Twitter. That's leading me to possibilities to publish in new outlets. I just published an op-ed in the Moscow Times, and that was work that came to me. I didn't pitch it, and that's been happening. That's also how I started writing for Playboy. The work came to me from an editor who had worked with me previously at Religion Dispatches. Also, her previous editorial resume includes Ms. Magazine, and I just kind of love that she's worked for Ms. and Religion Dispatches and Playboy. Yeah. But she reached out to me because she knew that I could write serious, trenchant critique of evangelicals, and they actually wanted to publish that in Playboy. Online only. It's not. You can't go get it in the print edition. But hey, that's still something. Yeah. So I'm getting. You
actually do write articles for Playboy.
I do, but you're not
speak of these mythical articles.
Go buy it off the newsstand.
Yeah. And so this all this upbringing and background gives you quite an insight into Trump and his base, and then you have academic experience with studying Russia. And you seem to be in a good position to follow what's happening.
I mean, I have got this very weird set of life experience and academic knowledge and skills that I am now trying to apply in other ways. And I can't independently pay the bills that way yet. I mean, without living rent free with my parents
yet.
But maybe I will be able to. My friend Lauren O'Neill and I are working on a co-edited anthology of personal essays by former conservative Christians, people from evangelical, Mormon, and Catholic backgrounds. It's a very diverse and interesting collection of authors, and that'll be coming out next year. Our deadline to finish it is the end of December. So we have a contract on that with Epiphany Publishers based in Indianapolis. And I'm talking to an agency about working toward my own proposal for my own book, which I have an idea for, and hopefully I'll finish the proposal before too long and get to work on that, and they'll be able to sell it. But yeah, in the meantime, I'm getting pretty steady flow of work.
That's so good to hear. So tell me more about your insights on Trump, on Bannon, on what just happened with the New Yorker festival, to get more current.
Such a debacle. Well, yeah, I mean, briefly, I grew up in the Christian right, and I think that my survival mechanism with all, this repression that I had, and I've always had some sort of tics and symptoms since I was a small child, where I was not a good fit for this authoritarian heteronormative environment, And I think that the way that I dealt with that was by living in my head. And even though I couldn't fully figure certain things out about myself, I could always distance myself from the environment I was in and try to think about it in a bigger abstract perspective, or increasingly in light of larger social trends and tendencies. The more I was able to read, the more I was able to learn about social phenomena. So I think that's partly what shaped me toward becoming a historian and an academic in general.
And what interested you in Russia?
So my first trip to Russia was in 1999, the year I graduated from Heritage Christian School in Indianapolis, and it was a short-term evangelical mission trip.
Nice.
Yeah, so I was in the hallway after school one day in spring of 1999, and the middle school orchestra director came up to me, and I didn't really know him, but it's a K through 12 school, so through the faculty meetings and things, he knew my mom, and he had learned from my mom that I'd gone on an educational trip to Germany and a few other European countries that the German teacher had arranged. I was taking German. And so he said, I know you're interested in international travel and things like that. So what about coming with me on this mission trip to Russia, which was being organized by a Greenwood, Indiana-based missionary organization that was then known as OMS, just by its initials, because even at that point, they understood that being called Oriental Missionary Society was not exactly a good idea anymore, not exactly good branding. They've since rebranded again, and now OMS stands for One Mission Society, which sounds so much cooler. So yeah, I was recruited for this, quote unquote English camp, where they would get Russians who were studying English or wanted to study English, or who had just enrolled in the Vladimir Oblast or province pedagogical university to study foreign language teaching, and give them the chance to interact with native speakers in a summer camp environment. We had to share our testimonies in the awkward way that Protestants do. And at the same time, it seemed sort of a little bit ecumenical, because there was some involvement with the Orthodox Church that year, and a priest came and led prayer services for the Russian students. But on the other hand, there was this weird sense that we were trying to convert Christians to Christianity, which was, to me, awkward. And the people who had more missionary experience did not seem to speak Russian very well, and I was not very impressed by that.
You speak Russian?
At this point, yeah, I mean, I didn't then.
Yeah.
That was then when I decided to start studying Russian, because I made friends, and, I had learned something about Russia, and I just got very interested in it. And it was a much more optimistic time after the end of the Cold War in some ways, and it was before the current Putinist crackdown on human rights and particularly scapegoating the LGBT community. I did go back for a second year to do that same kind of mission trip again with a lot of the same people after my first year of college, but I was already in an intense crisis of faith then, and I wrestled with that, thinking that, as someone who kind of doubts, probably I shouldn't go, but on the other hand, I promised people I would try to come back, and what if it revives my faith? So, I went again. At that point, there was no affiliation or interaction with the Orthodox Church in any way at all. So it was just purely, Protestants mostly trying to convert Orthodox Christians to Christianity. And our English lessons were reading from an English translation of the Bible, so it's not exactly subtle. Complete bullshit.
Amazing.
But from that experience, I started studying Russian, and I saw someone ask you on Twitter, if I might talk about learning Russian.
That was Gary Brooks.
It's a difficult language to learn. I would say that it took me probably about 9 years, though I wasn't studying it systematically or formally all through that time. But I would say, I think over about a 9-year period, I became fluent. And that included some tutoring, that included some classes. But at my undergraduate alma mater, Ball State, after the Cold War, the Russian major fell apart. So I could only take a couple years of Russian. That was actually at the Indiana Academy, which is a high school for advanced juniors and seniors, a public school, but you have to apply to get in, and it's affiliated with Ball State. So I took it there, and then on my Ball State transcript, it was just foreign language. So I got 2 years there. When I was studying abroad in Germany, I took another semester. I took several classes in Russian while I was in Germany. I hired a tutor.
And now we have this, this Trump administration with all this Russian influence, and here you are.
Yeah, so I went and I taught English in Russia for a year between college and grad school. And then in grad school, I went to study Russian history. And after my first year of grad school, I did an intensive Russian language study back in the same city, Vladimir, where I knew a lot of the people from the summer camps, where I had taught English. There's an institution there known as the American Home that brings in native speakers of American English to teach English to locals. So I did all of that, to really improve my Russian and get to a level of fluency over a period of years. And yeah, this has, now placed me in this weird position. I mean, I did my PhD in modern Russian history. I studied modern religious thought of the early 20th century. And I'm also now able to see how, Russian Christian critics of Marxism played into Western anti-communism. I'm tracing some of those historical networks, bringing some of this stuff back to the future, as it were. There's a long romance on the right in the West, certainly in Britain and America, but not only, with conservative Russians. There were even some white nationalists in the mid-20th century who thought that, they sort of understood that many Russians would more or less be on their side if they weren't contained by Soviet power. And, we had this love affair in America with Solzhenitsyn in the 1970s and the 1980s. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who, of course, is famous for books like The Gulag Archipelago and One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which is an intense short book that describes a 24-hour period in a Gulag prison camp.
And now GADSAT just uses the term Gulag to refer to SJWs that criticize him slightly. He thinks he's getting dragged off.
But here's the thing about Solzhenitsyn. It's important that he exposed the Gulag, but that doesn't mean that we should refrain from digging into and criticizing his own ideology at all, which was very anti-Western, which was essentially Slavophile, which was a kind of romantic Christian ideology. Now, he had lost his Soviet citizenship. He was expelled over his dissident activity, so he was held up as a hero and someone who was kind of a standard bearer for freedom in the West. But he didn't really want freedom. He didn't want atheist authoritarianism either. What he wanted was Christian authoritarianism. And he went back to Russia in his later years when Putin was consolidating power, and he died in Russia with Russian citizenship back, very pro-Putin. So you can look at some of the speeches and things that he made in the 80s also, and you can see that this should not have surprised anyone. Our right likes Russian Christians because they are really conservative. Much of our right is essentially, fine with authoritarianism as long as it's Christian. It's the atheism that bothered them. Authoritarianism.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, so let me just ask you another Twitter question here. Vladimir Alexandrov asks, Christopher, how do you think U.S. and the West in general should counter the Russian disinformation campaign of the last 3 to 4 years? Not just right-wing, but also some on the political far left are falling for RT, Sputnik, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's not an easy one to address. It's something that a lot of human rights advocates and policy wonks are thinking about. Some time back, I was flown into D.C. to go to Human Rights First for a discussion that was led by Melissa Hooper about precisely how we should address this issue. A lot of the thrust of that discussion was on getting the tech companies like Twitter and Facebook to take this more seriously. And it seems like belatedly, at least Facebook is making a little effort, though I'm still pretty disgusted with Facebook. But yeah, we talked about trying to find coalitions with, build coalitions with tech leaders, also apps that might be used to detect fake news, or to call out these sorts of things, or trace, the migration, I guess you could call it, of Kremlin propaganda talking points against through different media outlets. But I think in the meantime, we also have to just work hard to educate the public about the concerns. I always recommend Marcel von Herpen's book, Putin's Propaganda Machine. It's a very good book. Malcolm Nance has written about this. I have a lot of articles that touch on this issue. And hopefully we have learned some lessons from what happened in 2016, because I don't think the government is going to do anything to really protect our elections from this kind of interference coming up now in the midterm elections in 2018. It seems obvious that the Republican-controlled government doesn't want to take seriously an issue that's going to benefit them. But yeah, there is absolutely a problem with what I like to call the pro-Putin left, or what Sarah Kendzior sometimes calls the Polonium Tea Party. There definitely are these lefty bros who think that, the whole Russia investigation is ridiculous, and in some cases even seem to think of Putin as sort of an ally. I think for someone like Stephen F. Cohen, who writes for The Nation, he's married to the editor-in-chief of The Nation. He's a longtime Russian studies scholar who has been called Putin's American toady, I think not really inaccurately, by Julia Yaffa. People like that, people like Glenn Greenwald, I think they see Russian rhetoric that criticizes globalism or, the West, American imperialism as something that is, somehow leftists should support, even when it's not really being used in good faith.
Yeah.
And, do we have problems in America with imperialism and racism that we should confront? Yes. Do we really want to work with Vladimir Putin on that?
No.
I don't really think so. So unfortunately, they refuse to really think critically about this. They're perfectly willing, as, bros always are, whatever ideological coloring you find them in, hashtag not all bros, willing to throw women and members of the LGBTQ community under the bus, right? Putin is viciously scapegoating queer Russians, and they want to say, well, that's not our problem. So it's really annoying when people who also are otherwise credible do something like let themselves be interviewed on RT. And I think the best way to probably try to counter that is simply public backlash. When we see that, we should criticize it.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, the social media thing, I don't see the companies coming together to push these guys off at all.
They're not doing as much as they could or should. So, you know, we as people who actually want to have a functional civil society have to take matters into our own hands as much as possible. We should be really careful with where our information is coming from, particularly, let's say, if it's from a popular anonymous Twitter account or from a new news-looking site that may be of dubious provenance.
Mm-hmm.
Know your sources of information.
Yep, and I don't think enough people do that. So that's some good advice. Thanks so much.
You bet.
So what do you make of this whole campus culture war stuff where postmodern neo-Marxism fears come up every 2 seconds? And what do you make of all that?
I think it's a great way for certain middle-aged commentators to publish a lot of think pieces that caricature today's students and caricature the left. And it's a great way for contrarians to score rhetorical points.
Yeah, and also, have you heard of Peterson's obsession with communist art in his home? Like, apparently he has massive pieces, like, all over the place. And
no, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and he wants them there because, he wants to be reminded of the horrors. It's so strange to hate something so much, but to have it plastered all over your walls.
I mean, perhaps in a certain way, it's sort of a tell that at least viscerally he sees in communists a mirror image.
Yeah, I mean...
to go all Freudian here, I mean, I just call it like I see it. I'm just asking questions.
You're just asking questions. No conversations should be off limits.
Absolutely not, of course.
Yeah. And so what's going on with Trump, his base, with Bannon? What was the New Yorker thinking?
I think David Remnick still doesn't think he was wrong because his whole statement where he indicated that he had disinvited Bannon doesn't show any understanding of why people are actually concerned with the normalization of fascism. We have this kind of fetishization of free speech in our society, and a sort of fundamental misunderstanding of... But
it's also so hypocritical,
what the rights of free speech means. Absolutely, because someone like Steve Bannon would love to, and I mean, it's not hard to find comments on Twitter from people who would love to put liberals and leftists and cultural Marxists and, SJWs in jail, right? I mean, this is not hard to find.
Yeah.
But they claim that it's because they're being silenced. Nobody's being silenced. What we're arguing about is, what should the reasonable limits of discourse in civil society be? And I don't care how polite you are. If your fundamental view is that brown people are less human than white people, we should probably start an apocalyptic war with China and or the Islamic world. And we should deport all the people of color from this country. You don't deserve a prestigious platform.
It's strange to me that this has to be...
The New Yorker Festival is dangerous, and David Remnick just doesn't get it.
I don't get what there's not to get. Like, why did they have to disinvite? Like, why did they invite him in the first place? Like, do they not know who he is? He's not some obscure, random Twitter troll. He's Steve Bannon.
Yeah, his ideology is well known. He has published quite a lot himself. We can all do our research
to, like,
and
white
read Breitbart
supremacists
if we want to. There's video of him. There are interviews with him. You're not going to learn new things about Steve Bannon by interviewing him publicly on a stage and covering his travel and giving him a nice honorarium for that. So David Remnick's excuse for why he did this in the first place is bullshit. And it's just really weird how... the news broke through the New York Times over this holiday weekend with 2 major funerals going on. Did he want people to not pay attention? I mean, it's weird because Steve Bannon was a headliner, so somehow he was expecting that this was but why you drop that kind of news over holiday weekend anyway? And then, people that he had not consulted, who are also, major speakers booked for the festival, started dropping out and saying they won't share a platform with Steve Bannon.
But it just, to me, shows like such cluelessness.
Me too. I really don't get it at all. But then I had Morning Joe on this morning, and he was just repeating the same clueless line that apparently liberals live in bubbles and don't want to have their views challenged ever. When Jesus Christ, my views are fucking challenged all the fucking time.
Yeah.
He's living in a fantasy world, Joe Scarborough.
It's like you wouldn't want to legitimize an Islamist. Surely everyone can understand that. But if I, shrink this down to, the microcosm of movement atheism, back like 4 or 5 years ago when some British universities were inviting some problematic right-wing Muslim speakers that did have ties with Islamists and stuff, at that time, all these same people that defend this free speech for Nazis shit were all complaining to the universities. Why would you legitimize people like this? Why would you give them a platform? Why would you have them on your radio show? They don't belong on campus. But now the same people have completely changed their tune when it comes to the white right. And
that's ultimately how tribalism works. And for people who think like Steve Bannon or Vladimir Putin, all of this is a zero-sum game. So they're not really debating in good faith for a seat at the table. What they want is the power to dominate, and they're trying to pretend that they don't. And this should be obvious to everyone, but it's not obvious to David Remnick, Joe Scarborough. Not obvious to them.
But these are people in high positions and high media positions. That's what worries me. Like, with the New York Times publishing weird, the Nazi next door wants to, has a wedding registry with cupcake tins and like a cherry pie slice tattooed on his arm. He's just
like you. He just wants to kill all the Jews.
And then, Wall Street Journal published this horrendous piece about this writer going to London and being shocked about the multiculturalism there. He went in Muslim areas and was surprised to see Muslims. And
no-go zones.
I don't understand what's happening. Has everyone always been this clueless? Have I just been super naive that we're getting better in terms of racism? Obviously, I don't believe that now, but I used to. Like maybe 5 years ago, I'd be like, oh, come on. Things have improved a lot, and we're just headed towards a progressive direction. Nothing's going to hold us back from that now. How wrong I was, but...
the right has very successfully over the last 40 years or so shifted the Overton window so that, today things that should be simply moderate or normal views are considered super far left, and things that, are really damaging and destructive to the fabric of democracy itself are suddenly things that Joe Scarborough and David Remnick think should be included in the New Yorker Festival.
Right. And then there's Jack from Twitter who, was just reported on that he's went over other Twitter employees to make sure that Alex Jones and Richard Spencer stay on Twitter.
Meanwhile, he bans Bishop Talbot Swan, which is absurd. He
publicly apologized to Candace Owen for Twitter calling her far right. That's what she abso-fucking-lutely is.
Yeah, that's an objective statement. And if, a prominent, verified black man from his Twitter account cannot criticize a Trump-supporting black woman, that's really, really disturbing.
Yeah, I don't know the story behind that one, but yeah, there's been so many countless stories of that, right? Like ridiculous things people are being banned for. Meanwhile, Richard Spencer got reinstated and...
Yeah, Bishop Talbot Swan, I think he had in the 70,000s of Twitter followers, and sometimes would get into the hundreds of thousands of retweets because he was extremely critical of Trump and Trump-supporting white Christians, but occasionally of the Trump-supporting black Christians that are out there. And this comes back to the beginning of our discussion about working with progressive believers now. Sometimes, he would use rhetoric that would indicate that these Trump-supporting Christians aren't real Christians or aren't good Christians. But, I strongly disagree with that. I've registered my disagreement with that. But nevertheless, sometimes I'd retweet him I like him.
Yeah.
You know, he was a good figure in the Twitter resistance. And so I've been trying to get this hashtag reinstate Bishop Swan to trend now in the hopes that maybe Jack will, get enough pressure that he has to let him have his account back.
And let me guess, none of the free speech, free Milo, free Richard Spencer types care about this ban, eh?
I sure don't seem to see them caring about it. Yeah.
That's the thing. The people that are arguing...
It was Candace Owens who he criticized that got him.
Oh. Well.
And, he did use what would be a slur if a white person used it. But when a black person... And it's not the worst. I mean, it's not the N-word.
What was the word he used? I honestly don't know what tweet that was. So
it starts with C.
Oh, yeah. I would not. Mm-hmm. That's not a good word at all. It's not.
I mean, it's not. It's the second letter is O, not U. If that's
no. Yes, I know which one you're talking about. The racialized one, not the genderized one.
Right. So I think that he has the right to use that kind of language against a black person who shills for Trump. But even if he doesn't, for the sake of argument, should he be banned for it?
Yeah. No, I don't think he should be banned for it. But yeah, I would really express disapproval at usage of that. There are people who use that kind of language for ex-Muslims too, right? And as much as I really have come to dislike what a right-wing movement it's become, I really wish that people would make better points instead of reverting to these kinds of slurs and things. I think it would just make the point stronger if you just didn't use that kind of language.
Yeah, I mean, I can see both sides there. It's a question that could be argued and debated, but we don't have to litigate it now.
Yeah. Yeah, we can disagree on that, but the people that are complaining about Bannon being deplatformed or whatever, at the same time, you're seeing the same Trumpy people get so upset at Nike, and it's so silly too because.
Sorry, yeah, it is. I'm laughing at the silliness.
Yeah, I was away from Twitter for most of the long weekend, so I just dipped my toe in last night, and I'm seeing all these people with Nikes on their barbecues, and I'm at first so confused. What the hell is happening, right? What did Nike do? And they already have your money. What are you doing? You're not harming them.
These are the same people who smashed Keurig machines.
Right. These are the people who called other people snowflakes.
Yeah, but no, they can't wear Nike shoes now that Colin Kaepernick is the spokesperson for Nike.
Right. I mean, that's all that happened. I was surprised to learn that.
Whole different conversation to be had about whether, celebrity athlete endorsements should get so much money or, whether professional athletes should be paid so much. I don't really think that's equitable, but I also think this is ridiculous. And
that's
I really support Colin Kaepernick in his protest and starting the whole thing of taking a knee to protest violence against Black lives in America is an extremely important move that he made. And it's disgusting the way that the Trump administration pressured the NFL to crack down on it.
Exactly. So that is a real threat to free speech there when the government or the president is getting involved. This is different from some SJW on campus saying that a white guy can't eat a taco, right? As ridiculous as that might be, I've
not
got
any heard anyone say that, and I've spent a lot of time on college campuses.
I know. Maybe I have some
liberal and left-wing students.
I know. I'm just caricaturing it and exaggerating a little bit as well. Though there was some taco story, if I remember correctly, but I don't know all the details. So it could have totally been some Daily Wire headline that got stuck in my head. But
I remember about banh mi. There was a little bit of an explosion around, this college cafeteria made banh mi wrong and it was appropriation or something.
Oh, gosh. I mean, there's silly leftists too, obviously, right? Just because I'm on the left doesn't mean that I hold all those beliefs, right? If this was a less toxic time, then yes, I would spend some energy in trying to criticize those leftists. Of course, I generally vaguely criticize them now, but I'm not going to be making podcasts about what an injustice it is that they said it was cultural appropriation because the banh mi was wrong, or because they said this guy can't eat a taco, or whatever. There's silly stuff going on.
Right. I mean, on the level of priorities right now, that's super low, because we've got to expose this double standard, not only applied very effectively by the right, the fascist right now, I would call them, who are not arguing in good faith, and then the general double standard that we have in civil society, because the right has been successful at selling us this snake oil.
Oh yeah, and they've taken movements like the atheist movement with them. Like, they totally buy into this whole bullshit where the campus left is the end of the world, and let's make excuses for Trump, and let's make sure we're very nice to Trump voters, otherwise we're the ones pushing them to the far right. Well, I'm sorry, but that's bullshit. And if you think it works like that, then it can work the other way too. If you're not nice to minorities, if you're not nice to feminists, then maybe you're pushing them further to the left.
Yeah, and I mean, but that whole rhetorical approach is abusive. It's just, stop making me hit you on a social scale, you know? It is absolute bullshit. Yeah, we're in troubled times. That's for sure. We're in
very strange times.
And I also think, we want to hold our own accountable. And so when say, someone who helped to spearhead the very important Me Too movement gets accused of sexual assault, we can't be like, oh, well, she gets a pass.
Yeah.
We have to make sure that we keep our values consistent. At the same time, we have to realize that today, the predominant strain of the right is not doing that at all.
Oh, yeah, but that's where the left is at a disadvantage to begin with, because we are trying to be consistent. We will criticize our own. And that's when they're like, oh, the left eats its own, But...
Yeah, because we actually have consistent moral values.
Exactly. It's called...
But in terms of the toxic atheist community that insists that it does not exist, while all using the same talking points drawn from the same few authors and podcasters, but they're obviously not a community.
They're so not tribal either. They're the ones that have transcended the human condition of tribalism. I mean, just listen to the leaders. They just say that, no, I'm not tribal. I would know if I was being tribal. However, you're all tribal.
Yeah, I'm totally free of cognitive bias, and I'm not emotionally invested in proving that at all. So, I mean, I know you know this, but I wanted to mention, too, that I have this provocatively titled, play on Bertrand Russell, Why I Am Not an Atheist blog post,
I believe I've read that.
Criticizing the atheist community, because I do think it's important to do things like that now and again. Now, that's like, 1% of my blog, and almost all the rest of it is critical of right-wing Christianity.
But let me guess, you got a lot of hate for that one.
Oh, yeah. I had several days of intense pushback. It was worth it. The piece needs to be out there. And now, when particularly obnoxious atheist bros show up in my feed, I can just link them to it. Same with when defensive Christians say, hey, not all Christians, hey, I don't like Trump. I can post my stop calling them fake Christians piece. Because, you get tired of making the same arguments over and over.
Exactly.
So you write them into a blog post so you don't have to.
And in that vein, your hashtag empty the pews, like, I feel like two things about it, like, well, three things. Firstly, it's fantastic, it's catchy, and it's great that you started this up for people to speak about leaving evangelical circles or whatever. And secondly, I wish that we could do something like that in the ex-Muslim community, but so many of us are just they've kind of just allied with the status quo. So it's not really a genuine internal pushback anymore. It's we are hanging out with the Christian right, the Western right, and we're pushing back with them against Islam. That's not what we need, I think, for actual change to come. And then thirdly, I think I wish we could have something like that for movement atheism, like empty the pews, empty the podcasts. I don't know.
Hey, that might work. Empty the Petersons, empty the lobster serotonin.
But Peterson is actually a Christian who hates atheists. It's just so fucking weird that he has been so embraced by this weird movement. If you hate SJWs and feminists enough, doesn't matter if you're Ken Ham.
Horseshoe theory.
Yeah, you'll be loved by right-wing movement atheism.
Yeah, it is. It is really weird and troubling. I don't know. Maybe you should try Empty the Podcast.
But I have a podcast, and I'm an atheist, so I don't really want
could have broader. I mean, that could possibly go awry.
Yeah, I don't want to try that.
Of course, whenever you put a hashtag out in the world, if it really takes off, then people will use it in ways that are not under the control of the person who created it, and in ways that may subvert it. Empty the Pews and another of other viral hashtags, some of which I've started that we have in the Exvangelical community. You know, sometimes they get appropriated by right-wing Christians who want to yell at us and push back, which is always kind of fun though, because it gets the hashtag more attention.
Yeah.
But you know, they can also get subverted in other ways. So with Empty the Pews, as I originally framed it and I created it, it just kind of came to me as I was riffing in a Twitter thread where I was very upset about a year ago in August that, you know, white evangelicals were not criticizing, in some cases they were even defending Trump's comments on Charlottesville, where he said there are very fine people on both sides, you know, and I mean, Robert Jeffress was pretty soon on TV. He's the pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas, the church whose choir performed that disgusting "Make America Great" quote unquote hymn. Even I don't want to call that a hymn. The "Make America Great Again." He made a church choir song out of it. He was on TV saying Trump doesn't have a racist bone in his body. And I was, you know, I was just venting my frustration that you can't get through to white evangelicals at all. They don't listen to any criticism. What would they listen to? What would be a threat to them? And the phrase "empty the pews" came to me because they are afraid of losing the youth. They are afraid of losing numbers. They're very numbers grubbing. So that's how Empty the Pews was born. It was born as a protest against the racism of the Christian right, particularly white evangelicals who, you know, are upholding white supremacy, but for the most part, they will swear that they're not racist, you know, which is gaslighting.
Yeah.
So that's where it came from, and I asked people to tell their stories of leaving toxic Christianity, regardless of where they ended up. You know, whether they ended up in a healthier form of religion or no religion at all. Let's use Empty the Pews to share these stories and show people that the bigotry of the Christian right is driving people away from their churches, and from there, you know, we got a lot of interesting stories, and it became kind of a standby protest hashtag now, or hashtag that's used to expose abuses in religion, Christianity in particular. And where sometimes I get a little bit annoyed with the way people use it is when some people from the atheist community use it in a very explicitly anti-religious way. When yes, it's radical, it's radical phrasing, but I originally wanted it to be a little bit more
like a combative way. You mean like?
Inclusive. Well, like where they use it to try to, you know, express views against religion entirely. I'm not that annoyed with it. I'm only slightly annoyed with it.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I mean, if you actually ask me, I will admit that, yes, I think certainly at this point in humanity's development, organized religion does more harm than good.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, I think it creates problems that don't need to exist without it, but I also don't think it's going away tomorrow, and I'm not going to insist that people have to give it up in order to do it.
There's a way that it happens, like organically, and there's a way to be unhelpfully combative. And
right. And so I don't exactly like when people use Empty the Pews that way, but I also am not I'm not so upset about it that I would write a blog post.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's been good. It's been great to see. I've even seen some religious people like share the hashtag and stuff, so it's been interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I hoped would happen. So I'm really glad to see that many people who do still identify as some kind of Christian or Wiccans or people who have gone into just like spiritual or not and not religious or Buddhist or whatever, that they use it too. Because I want this to be a hashtag that is really specifically focused on the kind of Christianity that is the problem in this country. And that's, you know, it really isn't all the Christianity in this country. Pretty much you could say it is white Christianity writ large. But of course, there are many progressive white Christians as well. And then there's the whole African American liberation theology tradition. So, you know, why, if they're not going to be defensive about it, which some people initially were, then why go out of my way to alienate progressive believers who will fight for the same causes?
Right. I can understand that. I mean, yeah, I'm not a fan of religion in general, but I'm also a fan of being strategic in how to communicate that and not just being a douchebag to people.
Yeah, and to me, I mean, this is probably a step further than you would go, but I also I really want to tell people that they have their own moral autonomy, and if they get out of, you know, toxic white supremacist patriarchal Christianity and they still find a version of Jesus that they like and identify with, and they don't want to give up Christianity altogether, I'm going to tell them that that's okay.
Yeah,
you know,
I mean, I cringe at that.
That's a valid choice for them to
make. No, I cringe at that, but I totally understand that as well, because it is ridiculous and unrealistic to expect everyone to just drop everything, their social networks and every connection they've made, everything they've learned since they've been children. It's unrealistic. And this is this conversation that happens a lot in ex-Muslim circles is like, can we reform Islam or should we just eradicate it? And I find that so horrible a conversation to have, especially right now in the era of Trump and Bannon and Muslim bans and Breitbart and they some of them go to Breitbart or Rebel Media to have these conversations, like write articles about how Islam has no place on the planet anymore. Like, obviously, if you're going to the right to say this shit, they're going to love you for that and not for the right reasons. Once they can get Islam eradicated, their next target will be you. Yeah,
and I mean, Breitbart absolutely loves to publish people like that because it gives them cover.
Yeah, that was even in the Milo BuzzFeed piece.
They love to say, we publish Jews, we publish gay people, we publish trans people. So, you know, the people who play into that. This is the era of tokenism. I'm really disgusted with them.
It is. It's very disgusting. And
that's so, you know, calling that out is what got Bishop Talbert Swan banned from Twitter, and that's why I'm very upset about that.
Yeah. I just wish he hadn't used the word, but yeah, I think tokenism is a better word to describe the phenomenon in general, and it doesn't carry that racial baggage. As some people might say it does, but I don't think so. This is a real thing that's happening. There's trans people that are becoming very popular, anti-Muslim Muslims. There's even a fucking anti-Muslim alt-right imam. I don't know if you've heard of this guy.
I think I might have seen the Twitter account. I think you might have sent it to me, but remind me who he is.
His name is Imam al-Tawhidi. At Imam of Peace. He is fucking ridiculous. He praises
I've seen that account.
White nationalists. He goes on white nationalist podcasts. He also, Sam Harris tweeted praise for him. He's like a Sacha Baron Cohen character. You know, I've heard of people say. And it's just, he's so obviously stupid. He's so obviously not genuine. How can you have an imam that bashes the Quran, that says it's barbaric, that says most people practice a violent version of Islam? And how can you buy that he's legit? If you do, that means you are so blinded by your hatred and biases that you're not thinking clearly.
Yeah.
But this is the strange times we live in.
So they are.
Yeah. Right. Well, on that note, did you want to plug anything or send people anywhere to find your work?
Oh, sure. I have a blog called Not Your Mission Field, which is hosted at chrisstroop.com. There's also a resources page there for people who have come out of toxic Christianity. It has resources for those who have become completely secular, as well as for those who have stayed within religion. Even a couple listed that I really disagree with their approach and I don't endorse them. But, you know, maybe if you have people in your life who are absolutely not ready to abandon basically fundamentalist views, but you want to find resources for them so that they can get out of, say, a situation of marital rape or physical abuse, I have those kinds of resources there where people will frame that argument in a totally conservative Christian way. And yeah, you can find my writing in a number of different places. A lot of it I have done for Religion Dispatches. More recently, I've been writing fairly regularly for Playboy. I just published an op-ed in the Moscow Times. And it's easy to find me on Twitter. I'm at C_Stroop.
Excellent. So everyone give him a follow. And yeah, thanks so much for being on, Chris.
Thank you, Ina.
Take care.
You too.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Polite Conversations. You can support this podcast by sharing the shit out of it, making some noise about it, or contributing via Patreon. Patreon.com/Nice Mangoes. No E in mangoes. Also, you can follow me on Twitter at Nice Mangoes. If you want to make a one-time donation instead of a monthly Patreon one, you can do so via PayPal. nicemangoes.blog@gmail.com. Remember, no E in mangoes. If you've got an interesting story and would potentially like to be a guest, you can email me there too.